we're at 350 people. So I'm going to launch in because we have a fair amount to cover. I'm certainly going to cover the basics because there seems to be people are getting the basics wrong, and we'll have a chance certainly for Q&A. Just want to acknowledge Cygnus Contracting, one of TOA's business members, who are also the sponsor of this week's event, and thanks so much for their sponsorship. And if, you'll find them on the TOA directory for business members. Just as a little privacy note, and as we go through this, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat. The chat tends to have too much information, too many people back and forth to be able to monitor it. So put them into the Q&A. But just remember that these sessions do not constitute legal advice. Therefore, they are for general educational purposes only. If you need legal advice, if you need to talk to someone independently, and you need some referrals, give us a call. We'll give you a list of the lawyers that generically work with the association across the province to help out your strata corporation. With respect to questions, please refrain from putting any personal information onto any of the questions with respect to your strata corporation or with any of the neighbors that may be associated. So in this session, I'm going to cover the notice requirements for general meetings, the methods of notice, what's included with notice, the methods of conducting a meeting, and the definitions of voting, how a vote is calculated, and then the different methods of voting. So there are nuances in all of these little sections that we seem to generically be kind of off the tracks a little bit, that the industry is not complying with or not getting right, or we've just imposed standards or conditions that just simply don't exist in the Act. And so I'm going to review through those, and it will hopefully make logical sense to you. It kind of made logical sense to me, so I'm hoping that it will work and be valuable. This presentation will also be posted on the website, so you can download it and review it again if you need to reference something. So the notice requirements, Section 45 of the Strata Property Act, at least 2 weeks notice. 2 weeks notice is 14 consecutive days. We don't treat Saturday, Sunday holidays as different numbers. On a strata windup, it's an 80% vote. For an 80% vote, it's at least 4 weeks notice, so that would be 28 days. So we have to remember with notice that under Section 61, that when the notice is given by the corporation, is deemed to be there 4 days after it was either left with an adult occupant, put under the door, mailed to the address that you have, faxed, or emailed. And just remember to go back to the email section. You can only email notice to those individuals who have agreed to receive notice, and that would be official notice from the Strata Corporation by email. So for your protection, get those owners to provide specific instructions to you if you don't have them, that they've agreed to receive email. I think through the COVID restrictions and with Zoom and with email and all the interactions, so many more people are now electronically communicating. This is just simply going to become the norm. But still the best practice, get confirmation from the registered owner or the tenant who has been assigned an owner's rights with respects to how they're going to receive notice by email. And of course, you know, that the email is their responsibility to maintain, and that the strata will not be responsible if the email has been changed. So we've added 4 days for that. The Interpretation Act, which basically applies to all legislation, adds the date of issue and receipt. They're the delivery convenience is really what they are. So what we're looking at is 14 days of notice, 4 days for the notice period, and 2 days for the delivery and the receipt. So we're looking at 20 days of clear notice. Surprising the number of strata corporations within the last month alone that are still not meeting this simple basic requirement. Whether it's an electronic meeting or whether it's an in-person physical meeting, it makes no difference. The notice requirements are still the same. The agenda, again, we're having some issues here. The agenda itself, the order of the agenda, is determined in the bylaws of the Strata Corporation. So either Standard Bylaw 28, which shows the order of the agenda, or if it's amended in your bylaws. When you're preparing your notice packages, always read your bylaws to see if there are differences with respects to the order of the agenda or the materials for the agenda. You must include your proposed budget and your financial statements required by the regulations under 6.6 and 6.7 if this is an annual general meeting. You must include a schedule of proposed strata fees for the next fiscal year, showing the adjustments for increases and separate contributions for operating and contingency, again, if this is an annual general meeting. The question frequently comes up, how do we deal with the fees we didn't collect, for example, for January and February, because we're not having our meeting till March, but our fiscal year is January 1st to the end of December. On the schedule of fees that you include with your notice of meeting, you will show the adjustments to be able to collect the full amount for the fiscal year. And how you do that is going to be with your schedule of proposed fees. It could either be in the next month following that there's one single adjustment for the balance of the year, or they could be spread out over the following 9 or 10 months of the year. That's really what the Strata Corporation proposes, but this is one of the requirements of including the schedule of fees. Remember, it's based on unit entitlement also. That schedule is a schedule with your strata plan, a schedule showing how fees are calculated. The report on insurance doesn't yet specifically include any definitive summary or any details, but the best solution for the report on insurance is include the binder summary that's been provided by the broker. Include it with your notice package so that the owners have a physical copy of the information that you're going to give at your annual meeting. And it will include things like what you're appraised for, your values, what your deductibles are, what your coverages are, and if there's any specific exclusions for the policies. And then finally, you need to make sure you include the exact wording of 3/4 vote, 80% vote, and unanimous vote resolutions on the agenda. Those generally fall under new business. That's the purpose of category. If you look at the definition of the Act, new business are those things that we have given notice of. Those are resolutions such as 3/4 vote, 80% vote, and unanimous vote resolutions. Other things that we're finding that are missing on the notice requirements, and this is a chronic problem right now, we're missing the date of the meeting and the location. These are things that are coming up. Now, we frequently see the date, but the location, either physical or electronic, is not being included with the notice. The Act itself does not specify this. This is one of the interesting little quirks, but how do you expect people to attend a meeting if there isn't a location that's been identified on the notice? This is creating some of the problems. And here's one of the scenarios. Strata corporations or management companies are issuing notice and then advising within 48 or 24 hours of the meeting, everybody can sign on to get an access code for the meeting and pre-register. The difficulty with that is there's no room for any type of electronic failure or problem that may arise, which we've seen frequently, and it creates a lot of confusion. It's just the simplest solution. Include an electronic address that the owners can click on or enter into the URL to be able to register at the time of the meeting. Time and registration. This is something that seems to be omitted, is the time of the registration and when the meeting is called to order. Both are critical. People need to know, the eligible voters need to know when they can register. When's the port going to be opened? When can I actually go online and register? But more importantly, when is the meeting scheduled to be called to order? Many strata corporations still do not have a bylaw that deals with quorum requirements. And so Section 48 still requires that the strata corporation have a period of time of when the meeting is convened. If there is no quorum present within a half hour, the meeting itself then will stand adjourned for 7 days back to the same location, which would be either electronic or a physical meeting itself. An optional proxy form. Here, again, I won't go down the sea of proxy problems because I think that would be one seminar unto itself. But here's one of the challenges that we're finding, and again, this is arising, is strata corporations and property managers are still imposing the condition that this is going to be a restricted proxy meeting. There's no such thing. Whether it's an electronic meeting or a physical meeting, all of the same terms and conditions of the Act and the bylaws apply. The proxy form is optional. Owners may issue any type of proxy they wish. They certainly can impose restrictions on it, which is where we get their term restricted proxy from. But the individuals must still register all of those proxies, be present, and vote them like any other eligible voter. The other thing that's very helpful is instructions on how registration and voting will be conducted if the meeting is electronic. If owners know in advance how the voting will be conducted, how the meeting is going to be conducted, how registration will be conducted, how I will be recognized as a voting individual present at the meeting, these will all make your meeting substantially easier as you progress through the sequence of registration, certification of proxies, and then calling to order. So methods of conducting a meeting, there are really only two, with the exception of waiver of notice. We either have a physical meeting, which we have been doing for, since 1964, but we also have had strata corporations who have long since amended their bylaws in resort locations that have been doing electronic meetings for the last 20 years anyhow. So you can have a physical location and an in-person meeting, or you can have an electronic meeting, which is currently permitted by the emergency orders, but this can also be enabled through your strata corporation's bylaws. And if you have a general meeting scheduled in the next 3 to 6 months, I would recommend that you consider adopting a bylaw that enables electronic meetings. And then the benefit of that, of course, is it becomes an option should any circumstances arise. When the emergency orders expire, there will be a short window afterwards where electronic meetings are still permitted. But once that expires, the only option you will have as strata corporations will be a bylaw. The bylaw itself, there's a number of bulletins on the website that go to addressing what the bylaw itself should contain and look like. I'd recommend you look at that and talk to your lawyer about writing this bylaw. It's not as simple as saying we're permitted to have an electronic meeting. You have to deal with all of the other methods. You have to deal with registration. You have to deal with certification of proxies. You have to deal with voting cards and ballots and how the procedures will occur at the meeting. So it's much more complicated than simply having a bylaw that permits electronic meetings. I put this in red because I think this is a point that people are missing. Other than the method of participation, in-person versus electronic, there are no differences between a physical or an electronic meeting. All the provisions of the Act and the bylaws, the voting thresholds, voting requirements, registration, issuing of voting cards, certification of proxies, all of these conditions still apply, whether it's an electronic or an in-person meeting. And we've certainly seen from the CRT their decisions that uphold this and make this perfectly clear. The third option that exists, and a few smaller strata corporations have taken advantage of this, and it works easier if you're in a smaller strata corporation. It's a waiver of notice of meeting under Section 44 of the Act. And basically what this means is all of the eligible voters, all the owners can agree we're going to waive the requirement to have our AGM. However, to do that, what we need is we still need an agenda with our resolutions and our budget and our council nominations published, and someone's going to have to contact all the owners, and every owner is going to have to agree unanimously to all the resolutions, the approval of the annual budget, and the acclamation of the proposed strata council. So it basically, here's where we get the definition of acclamation of council under Section 44. What it means is everyone agrees to everything. And if one eligible voter does not agree, then you don't have a valid waiver of notice meeting and you'll be required to have a meeting. So there are basically, as we go through this, there are 4 different types of votes, with a 5th, which I'm going to cover under certain circumstances. It's important to know that that under the Act itself, these votes are defined. The 5th type of vote is not specifically defined and is a bylaw option for non-residential strata sections, is what it really comes down to. So when we're looking at the different types of voting, what we're looking at is the definition, and it's important to look at the wording in this definition. This applies to majority and 3/4 votes. It's a vote in favor of the resolution, and so then we would insert by either majority or 3/4 vote. cast by the eligible voters who are, and here's where we get into some of the critical language. They have to be present in person or by proxy. They have to vote at the time the vote is taken, and they cannot abstain if they want their vote to count. And when you look at that language and pull it together, you suddenly realize this prohibits any type of absentee or advanced balloting. The restricted proxy concept that people have been trying to impose would not meet the definitions of this if no one was executing those votes, or if those votes had been calculated in advance. They have to be cast at the time the vote is taken, so that all votes are treated equally, all votes are treated fairly, and they don't prejudice, we don't pre-publish or pre-review from one person who's collected them all what the voting impression is going to be, and it doesn't prejudice the outcome of the votes. It requires that all the eligible voters present in person or proxy have to be registered, they have to be present, and they have to vote. This is, again, people have been taking shortcuts, and I get that. They've been trying to make this an easier, simpler system. But one of the difficulties with the shortcuts is it doesn't comply with the definition of the Act. And the Act intentionally was worded this way because we didn't deal with absentee or advanced balloting. You're required to be present either in person or by proxy as you go through this. Majority votes. I still can't believe people are getting this wrong, Daryl, but they still are. We're still seeing votes being counted incorrectly. A majority vote, more than half of the votes cast by eligible voters who are present in person or by proxy at the time the vote is taken have not abstained from voting. So here's an example of a strata. 88 units were registered out of 140. The total of 88 votes is registered as eligible voters in person or by proxy. When the vote is taken, 41 voted in favor, 37 were opposed. That's less than half of the 88, but it doesn't matter. 10 people abstained. The abstentions, or those people who do not vote, simply are not counted in the voting calculation. So we take those in favor plus those opposed. That's our total number is 78. More than half of 78, which would be 39, is 40. So this motion is carried by example. So here's a good example of a majority vote where not everyone has voted, and less than 50% of the owners were present, were voted in favor of the resolution at the meeting. But as the chairperson or the person who's taking minutes or the scrutineer who's acting, it's important when you calculate these votes. The other option to this is the chairperson could declare this vote if when you took the vote on the poll or the roll or the show of voting cards or the call of the roll, it was overwhelmingly in favor. The chairperson still has the ability to declare the vote as carried. The 3/4 vote is a vote cast in favor of a resolution by 3/4 of the votes. So again, the same thing, 88 units registered for a total of 88 votes at the meeting. It's important also to understand if you're using any type of mixed use property, or if you're administering mixed use property, I'll show you that in a bit, but commercial and residential units, that 88 units registered may not in fact be 88 votes. It could be 84.3. or 92.55, because the commercial units will have different voting thresholds based on their proportionate size. We'll look at that when we look at a small schedule of voting entitlement. So this is about bylaw approval. This is only residential. There are no commercial or non-residential units here. So there are 62 units in favor and 22 opposed and 4 abstained. So that gives us a total of 84 votes. 3/4 of 84 is 63. This resolution would be defeated. And so it's important that you calculate these votes out correctly as well. Just in looking at some of the minutes in the past month that have, basically come out of some of these meetings, I'm really surprised at the number of times that the votes are not calculated properly. Just go through the basic exercise of calculating the votes correctly. An 80% vote for a windup. This means at least 80% of the votes of all eligible voters. So if my schedule of voting entitlement total is 114 votes, then it's 80% of 114 votes, which would be 91.2 votes. In this case, it's all residential, it would be 92. So that's the minimum number of votes that required. technically here, votes that abstain or do not register are not in favor of the resolution. So we're not really looking for those opposed. What we really want on an 80% vote is, do we have 80% of those in favor? We would certainly look to record all of those in favor, any opposed, any abstained when we're dealing with wind-up because of the court applications involved. And a unanimous vote means a vote in favor of a resolution by all the votes of all the eligible voters. 114 votes, you need 114 votes in favor. And again, votes that abstain or don't register, they're technically not in favor of the resolution. So here's the quirky fifth option for voting, and this is non-residential section bylaws under Section 197. A section that is entirely non-residential can adopt bylaws with different voting thresholds. So it's one of the things to look at if you have a strata corporation with residential and non-residential sections. Look closely at their bylaws. We see them frequently, and where there is a separate bylaw that's been imposed for things like the annual budget or the approval of bylaws or changes to property. Some of the requirements are substantially higher to ensure that there's more consensus within the community. The other condition that we frequently see with respects to non-residential section bylaws is the introduction of a 2/3 vote. And again, the same formula that's applied to 3/4 is applied to a 2/3 vote if it's been properly defined within the bylaws. So, it's just a flag with respects to the types of resolutions to look for them closely as you're going through in your bylaws. Calculating votes, I think, is really the essence of good governance when you're at general meetings. Count all the votes in favor and opposed. You can certainly include those who've abstained. You can certainly identify those who just simply did not vote. Calculate the precise numbers. The precise numbers could in fact impact your decision-making process. An example of that would be Section 51 of the Act, which is a reconsideration of a 3/4 vote. Strata Corporation may have approved a 3/4 vote for a special levy for a major repair, but it may have been less than 50% of the owners. The Strata Corporation has an obligation to wait at least a week to see if they've received a petition to reconsider that vote, unless it's an emergency or it relates to an order that is associated with repairs. So the precise numbers for 3/4 votes really are essential. The other benefit, of course, is in the event that the strata corporation is involved in a dispute, the precise numbers will provide much clearer evidence of the voting procedures and the results of the voting. Always refer to the registered schedule of voting entitlement. Some buildings do not have voting entitlement because they were simply smaller, all residential, and in absence of a schedule of voting entitlement, each strata lot has one vote. That's already deemed by the Act itself. In electronic meetings, and here's where we get into some of the challenges. On electronic meetings, try to use only a polling method that identifies who is voting. So Zoom is a good example. If we use polling under the participant function, not a separate poll created for the purpose of consensus of owners. But if you use the polling under the participant function, it will continue to show the name of each person, how many votes they're representing, and then you can calculate through that scroll and through that poll what the total number of votes is cast. A generic poll does not show the increased number of votes or disclose who is actually voting. And that's one of the challenges with polling on most of the electronic platforms. Try to find a platform that enables you to verify who is voting and how many votes they're representing. That would be no different than if we were all in a room together and I've asked everyone to put up their hands with their voting cards. As the chairperson, I can see who is voting. I can identify if we have non-residential units by probably a different color, and I can calculate what those are. Those voting cards probably have unit numbers or strata lot numbers on them, which helps to identify what the different voting thresholds are. Apply the same conditions to an electronic meeting. Is there a method or a platform I can use that will ensure I can still identify who is actually voting? Here's a schedule of unit entitlement from a commercial property. This is very common, and everyone looks at this and they say, really, we didn't know? How are we supposed to calculate this? This is one of the reasons why you need to be able to identify who is voting. If you can't identify who is voting and you have a mixed-use strata corporation and commercial units are attending, then you probably have a calculation problem, and it's quite possible you may or may not have had a successful result in your resolutions. This is one of the reasons why accurate voting is necessary. It helps us. Having a schedule of the voting entitlement is essential to make sure that the voting results are calculated accurately. You'll see some of the votes here are quite a bit smaller, and what this really refers to is proportional size in this building. In this building here, the strata lot with 1.7 votes, the commercial unit, is 1,700 square feet. And the strata lots with 0.65 votes are only 650 square feet. And so there, this is a smaller strata corporation of 28 units. I've just taken their basic commercial units and the first two residential to be able to show the difference between residential units at 1 vote per strata lot and the voting entitlement of proportional voting based on size of the other commercial strata lots. There are 2 strata plans that I'm aware of, one in Victoria and one in Kelowna, where all residential units, but the penthouse units somehow had 2 or 3 votes that were allocated to their units when the strata plan was registered. So, it's well worth looking at what the outcome is. So let's look at Standard Bylaw 27. Again, this is a decision of the CRT as well. Strata corporations must convene a meeting, whether electronically or physically in person. They must convene it in accordance with the Act. Voting cards must be issued to eligible voters. How we issue in person is simple. We issue a physical voting card, people hold it up at the meeting, we can see the results. Electronic is much more difficult. And so, where Daryl is located on the screen, can I rename you Daryl? I don't think I can.
Yeah, I think you can.
It doesn't work as well on this. Let me just see here. So here's a good example. So Daryl would be, so we would rename him. And so we will call him Strata Lot 15, and maybe we will put his name, and we'll also say maybe he has 11 votes, because that there will enable us to identify his unit plus additional proxies that he's holding. And once we've done this, everybody can see it on the screen now. Once we've done this, it gives us the ability to say he is technically registered. We probably included with our notice a requirement and a website and a web location or an email address where the proxies could be sent in advance so they can all be registered. But certainly if somebody attends a meeting, if you were just attending the meeting at this point and you had 2 proxies, the Strata Corporation is still going to need to see the proxies to be able to certify them, but they need to provide you with some sort of platform or email address where you can send them in immediately so that they can actually be registered and certified. Again, electronically, what we've done now is by having created his strata lot number, we know how many votes he's representing, including proxies. What we've essentially done is we've given Daryl a virtual voting card. And the virtual voting card enables him to represent his unit and the balance of the units throughout the meeting. It's very helpful when you do this to include, you can include as much information as you want. The difficulty is with the participant polling on many of the platforms, the more information you include, it tends to get dropped off. So try to identify on your registration list, and this is a key job for the property manager and for the person who's chairing the meeting, identify on your registration list clearly which units are being represented by which person so that you have a cross-reference when you're counting votes and the outcome of votes and ballots. Again, if there's non-residential strata lots, identify them by the strata lot number so that the chairperson can identify them clearly. You would also put their votes, and you would need to know their voting entitlement. So if strata lot 15 was a commercial strata lot, I could look at my list on the voting entitlement and say, okay, strata lot 15 has 0.88 votes. I will need to calculate those when I go through this. Don't think that this is any more onerous on an electronic meeting than it is in a physical in-person meeting. We find this gets overlooked almost all the time anyhow. It is one of the challenges that we see that mixed-use strata corporations are not recognizing these in in the appropriate way with respects to how the voting allocations are happening and how they're being cast. Again, if we look at Standard Bylaw 27, this is the bylaw that talks about the procedure of how votes are done. So at general meetings, votes are decided on a show of voting cards unless an eligible voter requests a precise count. So voting cards traditionally raised, we just raise our voting card, all in favor. We've even been doing this at electronic meetings in the past couple of months, even with 80 to 100 people at a meeting. It's very easy for majority votes to be able to use voting cards to be able to get consensus on this. The polling function, and again, this is the participant polling function, not the survey polling function, but the participant polling function or the polling function that identifies who each person is so that you can calculate all the votes is really what's essential for the strata corporation if you're using some sort of poll. So visual confirmation or participant poll both work incredibly well as you go through this. But just remember, the chairperson and the scrutineer, they have to be able to identify who is voting. If you can't identify who is voting, how do you know what the voting results are? How do you know that only eligible voters have been voting? You know, strata corporations permit multiple people to attend these meetings. They might be an owner and the spouse of the owner, or an owner and a family member, could be a tenant. Strata corporations do permit multiple people to attend meetings. Not all of them are eligible voters. So if you can't identify who's voting, you're going to end up resulting with some voting irregularities as you move along. Part 3 of Standard Bylaw deals with the precise count and the discretion of the chair. Some strata corporations have amended this in a small way, but it really comes down to the chairperson making a decision about how to do this. So if there's a precise count requested, so we're doing the vote on the annual budget, Daryl has just raised his hand and said, Mr. Chair, I'm requesting under the bylaws that we have a precise count of the voting for the annual budget. So this is where the chairperson has to decide. Are we going to use voting cards where everybody holds up their card? Are we going to call the roll, do a secret ballot, or some other method? A roll call is a physical, verbal interaction with each owner. We would go through the list of eligible voters, ask them how they vote. Strata Lot 15, how do you vote? For, against, or abstain, they will announce how they vote. That's what gets recorded. Or it could be a secret ballot, which we'll talk about in a second, which is a bit complicated, or some other method. Some other method gives us flexibility in the bylaws, and that I think we could use and employ with respects to polling on platforms that enables us to account for who is voting and the results of the votes that were done. Show of voting cards is a visual count. Call of the roll, verbal confirmation. Now, secret ballots, you have to look at what the intention of a secret ballot is. The secret ballot really is there to ensure the privacy of the individuals from the corporation, and that would include council members as well. So with secret ballots, do we have the ability to set up an anonymous ballot or a polling station? Step back and think about in-person meeting with respects to secret ballots. Someone's called for a secret ballot. We have a major repair. How do we get the ballots into their hands? Generally, how this would apply is each owner that has been certified with a voting card and is eligible voter in person and by proxy comes to the voting station. They receive a ballot for each one of their voting cards they're holding. They're verified off. They go to a privacy booth. They execute their ballot. The ballot goes into a box. What's occurred during this process is we've identified who's voting. We haven't identified how they're voting. And so how can we apply that same condition with respects to electronic meetings? And we've put this through the test a few times. It really requires a significant level of independence apart from the strata corporation if there's going to be a secret ballot. So do you have an independent chairperson, or do you have an independent scrutineer to act for the corporation who will receive the ballots, verify they're eligible voters, but receive the ballots and be able to calculate them and report them back to the chairperson of the meeting report them back to the property manager so that they can be properly calculated. This is one of the difficulties. Secret ballots are very difficult to manage on an electronic basis, because the difficulty is you can't cross-verify not only is it a secret ballot, but is this an eligible voter who's cast this ballot? And there's really no anonymous way of doing this and being able to audit the outcomes of the ballots at the same time. There are some electronic platforms that allow for balloting in an anonymous way. The difficulty with that is there's no way of identifying who has voted. We don't want to know how they voted, but the difficulty is identifying who has actually voted and cast their ballot, which is a problem because we can't cross-verify whether they were an eligible voter or not. The other challenge is people with multiple votes. How are they actually executing those votes with respects to proxies that they're holding? How do owners participate and vote? Well, here's a lot of the problems that owners are having. And I think a lot of this happens because no one thinks or contemplates about what the outcome is with respects to the notice package. When you issue your notice, there are a few options that you can actually execute with respects to electronic meetings. One is you can actually have a bit of a dry run a week before with respects to how voting will take place. Owners can attend, people can ask questions. How will the votes be conducted? How will proxies be managed? It's really a great opportunity, and in extremely large strata corporations, we found it to be incredibly helpful in working out the bugs in the voting process. But again, what happens if there are, if you don't have the time for that, or the administration for that? Another option is publish the instructions on voting in the notice package. How will votes be conducted? We will be using the poll system, the participant poll, which will identify who is voting, how their votes are cast, to be able to ensure that we end up with a precise count. My preference with most of these meetings, without fail, is to have an exact count or a precise count for every vote that's taken. We may actually have a generic majority vote to approve the minutes of the last meeting of the previous general meeting, and it may be that everyone has voted in favor except for one opposed. That we would record in the minutes. The resolution was carried by majority vote with one person opposed. So we have a record of what actually occurred at the meeting. You could include a ballot or a sample ballot in the notice package. This is not a voting card. This is not a proxy. This is just a ballot that can be used for each of the eligible votes. And some strata corporations have done this, especially for some significant resolutions where they really require accuracy with these. The ballots themselves can then be emailed in a window during the meeting. The ballots are counted, collected, calculated, and reported before the meeting is terminated. So the outcome of all of the ballots is known. It's a method that can be used effectively, provided it's not a ballot system that's intended to replace a voting card. You still have to issue some sort of virtual voting card at the beginning of the meeting. But a ballot of some sort would need to be in the hands of the owners. It would be no different than if during the meeting, the chairperson decided we're going to do this vote here by ballot. You still have to get the ballots into the hands of the eligible voters. So it would, again, it gives an opportunity for balloting for accuracy, for a record of how people voted. If you're using balloting, the ideal is to have the strata lot number on each of the ballots to ensure that when they're collected, there can be no duplication, and there's a cross-reference between those who are registered that are eligible in person or by proxy versus those who may not have attended and who have simply tried to send in an absentee ballot. Putting the instructions on your notice package of how the meeting is going to be conducted, how the balloting is going to occur, how it's going to be countered. It really helps the owners be prepared and enabled for the meeting. I just want to talk a little bit about the proxy issue though, because it keeps coming up. There is no provision in the Act for a meeting solely by restricted proxy. If all of the owners consent to such a method, that's fine. It's akin to basically having a waiver of notice of meeting, and why not just do a waiver of notice of meeting? But a restricted proxy or a proxy with restrictions is a privilege of an owner, not a condition that the strata corporation can impose. Strata corporations also cannot impose conditions such as we will not permit amendments discussion to resolutions at our general meeting. Those are conditions of the Act. The strata corporation can't prohibit those conditions from taking place. I saw a notice package yesterday that we were looking at where the notice package specifically prohibited amendments. Yet this is the annual general meeting, and at an annual general meeting under Section 104, it clearly says an amendment to the annual budget may be made by a majority vote. The strata corporation cannot prohibit amendments. You're going to have to figure out how to do the votes. You're going to have to figure out how to accept the amendments and how to vote on the resolutions as amended. The legislation for proxies talks about subject to any restrictions or limitations imposed by the owner, not by the strata corporation. The proxy may be restricted solely to voting instructions, and the proxy itself may not perhaps be used for amendments or other business, which is one of the reasons why the corporation needs a copy of the proxy. You need to be able to verify whether there are any restrictions or limitations on this proxy. The proxy itself is not a ballot or a vote. It's just simply an instruction to the proxy designated proxy holder, which means whoever they are, whether it's a council member who's agreed to, represent all 25 of the proxies that were submitted, they must still attend the meeting. They must still register all those proxies. They must still execute and vote all those as if they were eligible voters present, which they are, in fact, under the Act itself. And then, of course, just remember that whoever is the proxy holder has to be registered at the meeting. They have to register the votes at the time the vote is taken. There's a few methods of voting permitted in the standard bylaws, but look closely if any of your bylaws, if there are any changes or variations. The methods of voting themselves are going to be things like show of voting cards, polling of the owners, secret ballot, polled ballot electronically, but look closely to see if there are some other variations within your bylaws. And if you're going to do an electronic bylaw, my recommendation is talk to your legal counsel about how that bylaw is going to be written and specifically deal with the matter of secret ballots. It's an arduous and complicated process to try and provide some method of confidentiality for people who are voting when you're dealing with electronic meetings. And so it's very well addressed when you're dealing with the meeting itself. Again, look at, I'm just going to reiterate this again, look at majority and 3/4 votes. They are only counted at the time the vote is taken. Again, this seems to be getting wrong over and over and over again, but they need to be calculated. The votes need to be exercised. This isn't a group of council members sitting in a room who are just calculating proxies that have come in. The meeting has to be convened. The votes have to be cast. The votes have to be calculated as you go through this. Again, lastly, what if the strata is mixed use? Remember, you have to clearly identify voters and their voting entitlements. Also remember that if you're voting on bylaw amendments, both the residential and the non-residential or commercial have to vote separately by 3/4 vote to approve those bylaw amendments when you're dealing with mixed use strata corporations. Nomination and election of council. This is the really juicy part, I think, that everybody struggles with. We have confusing information around case law. We have mixed information around how this happens within a variety of bylaws for strata corporations. Without doubt that the general consensus within the legal community and with everybody that deals with this is that the election of council is a majority vote. Acclamation is dealt with in the Act under a waiver of notice. It is not extended to other portions of the Act. And look closely at how you're dealing with nominations, how you're dealing with the election. The nomination process, and strata corporations have been trying to do this to encourage people on council. They're nominating or getting volunteers to agree for council in advance, so that when they come to the meeting or when people send in their proxies, they already have a list of people they can select. If you have a nominating process, this really needs to be a bylaw. If you don't have a bylaw, then technically each person who's willing to stand for council still has to be nominated at the AGM. You need the consent of those people to agree to have them elected to council. And then, of course, they would be elected by majority vote. And a majority vote is simply going to be those council members who've received a majority of the ballots that have been cast. You can add additional nominees at your AGM. The difficulty with that is you may have already received more than 50% of all of the instructions from owners may have gone by proxy to the proxy holders. So the additional nominees may not necessarily be have had enough support to be elected. This is certainly something that we've been looking at to try and deal with through a bylaw process. How do we deal with a nominating process? How do deadlines work? How do those nominations get supported by nomination at the general meeting? Are there additional nominations permitted at the AGM? It's certainly something that is best dealt with through the bylaws, because the Act and the standard bylaws themselves really are quite silent on the process of how nominations occurs. Okay, Daryl, I'm going to stop talking because I know I can just see stacks and stacks and stacks of questions.
Yes, yes. So I think I'll start off with one of the first ones. Is there a way for owners of multiple units to vote all their units in a Zoom poll feature, or how would you recommend to do this in a Zoom meeting? So I think you touched on that, but maybe just a little more clarity on the difference between those two things that you talked about.
The problem with the Zoom poll feature is that the poll feature itself doesn't identify who is actually voting. They just give the participant numbers. So the two problems with it is you don't know if a participant who's not an eligible voter has cast a ballot. And that could be a variety of people. Anybody who's on the Zoom, including scrutineers, the property manager, anyone who's helping administration, they'll all be on the system. They can all vote on the poll. And the difficulty with that is they can easily influence the numbers. The other problem with the polling function is if I'm representing multiple votes because I own multiple units or I hold a bunch of proxies, the poll function doesn't reflect that. So that's a bit of a problem. However, if you go into the participant function on Zoom, and the participant function also works in a number of the other platforms, if you go into the participant function, it will show me a list of who actually voted. It shows me also how they voted, so I know the outcomes. It does give you a polling summary, but the difficulty is it only gives you a polling summary of the number of people who participated, not the number of votes they represented. So we've looked at some other platforms to see if there's some way of doing this. None of them are perfect yet. That's the overriding problem. There's really none of them have the answer that we really want. What we'd want in a perfect world is some sort of chart form that shows who voted, how many votes they're representing, and what the outcome of those votes are. And again, with proxies, I could be holding 20 proxies, but 15 of them might vote one way, 5 of them might vote another way. So that's one of the challenges. At least with the polling function under the participant, it will show me who has voted. And by knowing that, I can then look at my registration list. And from the registration list, I know how many votes are represented, so we can get an accurate count of those votes. I wish we had an electronic platform that really did this clearly. But you know, of all the ones we've surveyed, all the ones we've basically put through a test run, they all essentially have the same challenge.
Yeah, and that actually answers a couple of questions, because there were questions about managing that voting when you've got these multiple, like how do we know which way these person's proxies want to vote? And typically you would have received those because that's part of your request when you're making the package up, right? So
right.
So that would then the strata would have the opportunity, the scrutineers, to cross-reference, which is the key to being accurate, right?
And on your 11 votes, when you voted, you could, you know, however you voted, it could be yes or no, but at least you're right. I will have those 10 proxies in front of me with those instructions on them, but they may not necessarily have been restricted proxies.
No.
They might have just been, for the most part, general proxies, which is fine. I'm still going to have to verify with you. If there's some doubt, you're probably going to have to ask the individual, how are each of your votes calculated, please? And it's going to take a little bit more time to go through and call the roll. But at this point, it's the only option to be able to get accurate voting results.
Yeah, okay, that's awesome. And so So there's some stratas that are asking, well, we've already held these meetings and we've forced them to use the restricted proxy process, and how do we deal with that conflict, or potential conflict?
You know, unless someone has taken this to the CRT at this point, and the CRT may or may not necessarily find that there was a defect in the outcome of the meeting, other than the procedures were not necessarily compliant with the Act. The CRT might order that the meeting is null and void and they have to have another meeting and comply with the Act. Or, you know, the CRT may also say, well, look, you know, this didn't comply with the Act, but there was no effect to the strata corporation as a result of it, so there's no need to have another meeting. It really comes down to the adjudicator to decide what the effect of that was. If you've already done this and your strata corporation, you know, you've met the basic requirements of the Act with respects to notice, but you're aware that, you know, you did force a restricted proxy only meeting, didn't allow people to register. If no one has complained, you know, if you're concerned about it, I'd say call your lawyer and have a discussion with them and say, do we have a problem here? But many strata corporations in the last 6 months did this anyhow. You know, they're just figuring out that, you know, you can't do this. You have to move forward. You know, a number of management companies have been really pushing restricted proxy meetings, basically because it's less work. You know, it's easier, it's less work. You don't have to deal with the online interaction and registration. And so I think you're going to have to evaluate whether this really had a negative or material impact on your strata corporation.
Right. And then I think talking again about secret ballots, again, I think owners are struggling, or people on the online here are actually struggling with that process, you know, and the reality of holding an electronic meeting and trying to conduct a somewhat secret ballot.
So, so I acted as the scrutineer for a court-ordered meeting last month. And we figured out, with the participation of the council and all of the owners, how to conduct a secret ballot in a way that the individual, how owners voted could not be identified by the strata corporation. And so we, you know, again, you know, you have to be independent. You can't work for the management company, can't be an owner, can't have a relationship, but the scrutineer gets appointed independently. In this case, the email address provided, the ballots went directly to the scrutineer. The scrutineer counted the ballots and verified that all of the ballots were in fact eligible voters. And then the only thing that gets reported to the strata corporation is the outcome of the vote. How many for, how many against. And it was probably the closest option to a secret ballot. But we also had the consensus of all of the owners to agree to that process as well, which was helpful. You know, if someone could certainly disagree and challenge that. But again, secret ballots are a very complicated process at the best of times. Secret ballots with respects to electronic meetings are even more of a challenge, but it requires a high level of independence with respects to the meeting itself. The other thing that occurred at the meeting is, at the end of the meeting, the ballots that were cast for the purpose of the secret ballot, the owners unanimously agreed to destroy those ballots at the end of the meeting, so that there was no risk that the ballots and how they were cast was going to be shared with the strata corporation. And given the dynamics of the community, it was a good solution.
Great. And then just another question about the proxies that are received by the strata, or the information received from owners by the strata, retaining it, who has access to it. You know, that's kind of a theme that we're seeing here too.
Well, you know, the difficulty for proxies and the difficulty with correspondence sent and received is, and this is the double-edged sword for strata corporations. Strata corporation says, we need to see your proxies, and I think you do. I can't certify a proxy we haven't seen. We don't know if it was for the right unit. We don't know if it was signed by the owner. We really don't know whether it was a valid proxy or not. We need to retain a copy of the proxy for our records. The difficulty is the strata corporation starts to retain records that then become accessible under Section 35 of the Act. And so, you know, that may come down to a very specific order through the tribunal as to whether those proxies, those ballots, those voting cards, whether all of those are actually to be provided. I think one of the conditions that might be on that is Was there an expected level of confidentiality, or was there a secret ballot involved with this in trying to evaluate whether it needs to be provided? But again, it becomes correspondence for the strata corporation. And if your strata has difficulties with this, or you have a challenge, my first phone call would be to your lawyer to say, what do we do about this? You know, do we provide these? You know, and in advance of collecting all of them, are we aware that we may be required to retain them? That's one of the difficulties. And so, you know, it's sometimes when you get to that point, your first call is, what do we do about it?
Mm-hmm. And so there's been a couple of questions about joining meetings through phone or dealing with no internet at all. So how do we manage meetings through a Zoom platform without internet?
Well,
like a call-in function, essentially. How do you deal?
You know, it's no different than a physical meeting. Our meeting is going to be at the Wise Hall on March 6th at 3 p.m. If you can attend, great. If you can't, send a proxy. Our meeting is going to be March 6th. Here's your Zoom address that you will link in and attend. If you can't attend, here's a proxy. It's, you know, there aren't special accommodations made because it's a different platform. It is, you know, it's unfortunate, but not everybody attends all the meetings. You know, people are making this argument that because it's electronic, we can't attend. The reality is the number of people actually attending meetings in person by proxies has increased by 100%. Because we've gone to electronic format. A lot, you know, many of us are home working at home anyhow, but just the accessibility and the people that can access these meetings worldwide has increased substantially as well. You know, so, you know, the downside of this is there's a number of people who really don't want all these people to attend these meetings. They just like to have their nice little comfy meetings, get it over. But I have not had, I don't know about you, but in the last year, I've not had a single electronic meeting that we've not had a quorum. It's been more prior to that meeting, we frequently with the quorum attending. So, you know, the participation rate has dramatically.
Great. And I think we're kind of losing you, so this might be a good time to wrap it up. I believe the Zoom meeting invites can include call-in numbers, and owners can participate that way. You don't have to do it by video, so you can actually just phone in from your phone, and you can participate in most of the voting. But I guess you would then have to submit a ballot electronically or some other method during the voting if it's required. So
it comes to this person who's chairing the meeting, and you can certainly, and I recommend it, to accommodate people as much as possible. Always do it. Phone contact available. Identify them on my screen exactly the same. I would see a phone number and I would put strata lot 15, 11 votes, so I would know who I'm talking to. Pull that person. I would have to ask them, how are you voting? So down to the skills of the person who's facilitating the meeting to remember, I'm going to have to basically an inventory of all these voters and ask everyone. There was also a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say there was a question that emailed me earlier that has really nothing to do with this, but it is relevant for strata corporations right now with respect to schools and hubs and club rooms and all of those things. And that relates to this, that it does require a 3/4 because it would be a significant change in the use of a common facility. The difficulty, this is part of the challenge is when to functions and facilities, they did not make it clear about what was happening. Most of the other provinces issued orders that were very clear that gymnasiums, swimming pools, and rec centers were closed within condo buildings and within strata buildings. So BC, it was kind of left vague, and that's why we ended up with so much ambiguity around this. If your strata corporation wants to close your facilities, keep them closed, convene a meeting, get the owners to approve that, at least for the balance of the emergency orders.
Great. I think there may have been some dragging of your voice on that one. So we'll make sure that that the recording hopefully will have recorded something better. If not, you can always submit your questions to us. So yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated to have so many people participate. If you have follow-up questions, by all means, send them to us. We would love to at least see your experiences as you've been going through this. If someone has discovered a fail-safe, idiot-proof polling system that we can use, we're open 100% wanting to find out what those platforms look like. We did, you know, on a humorous side, we did find a platform that would actually meet all these expectations, but the cost was $10,000 per meeting. So we're hoping that service provider realizes the problems with that cost. But in the meantime, you know, keep going with your electronic meetings. And thanks so much for joining us. Again, this will be posted on the website and on our YouTube site as well. So the video is available for everyone.